A strange alien parasite bit him. Now the entire alien cat species can't resist him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, echoing through the labyrinthine corridors of the abandoned space station. Sparks flew from damaged circuitry overhead, casting flickering orange shadows against metal walls scarred by years of conflict. He stood motionless for the length of a single breath, eyes narrowing as he felt the floor vibrate beneath him, a subtle sign that he was not alone. "Strange," the voice purred from the darkness ahead, a low, taunting growl that sent tension thrumming through the stale air. "You reek of prey, but you don't look like the kind that runs." He said nothing at first, letting that challenge hang. In front of him emerged a figure both alien and undeniably alluring. Her dark hair, sleek and glossy, framed a face shaped by predatory grace. Tall, lithe muscles rippled beneath skin that caught the erratic lighting in a mesmerizing play of shadows. She had pointed feline ears that twitched with predatory focus and eyes that reflected a keen intelligence, plus something else, something that went beyond mere interest. She angled her head, letting her lips curl in a half-smile, perhaps expecting him to beg for mercy or try to flee. But Dax, scarred soldier, veteran of too many battles, did neither. He lifted his chin, drawing a slow breath. Beneath his ribs, the place where that damned parasite had bitten him still burned, a persistent reminder of the unexplained infection coursing through his veins. His mind flickered over the memory of how quickly it had happened, the creature latching onto him in a blur of movement, sinking needle-like fangs into his arm before he could react. Now standing in this dim corridor with a group of these feline-like huntresses closing in from all sides, he realized its venom was doing something more than just ravaging his body. These aliens, especially this one, fixated on him with predatory hunger, but also something deeper, as if they were responding to an invisible lure. He finally spoke, voice steady and challenging. "I won't run," he said, "but I promise you'll wish I had." The alien female, he didn't yet know her name was Nyx, chuckled low in her throat. The sound had the quality of a rumbling purr. Behind her, silhouettes of other feline warriors flickered in and out of the corridor's gloom, their eyes glinting whenever the overhead sparks caught them just right. One of them moved to flank his right side. Another hovered behind as if ready to pounce. Dax's muscles tensed. He was outnumbered, outmatched in this place, but that had never stopped him before. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a habit he'd never quite broken. It was a reflex, maybe, from all the times he'd stared death in the eye. He felt that flicker of confidence rise in him again. He should have been terrified, but something about that burning bite on his arm was altering his instincts. He found himself strangely calm, attuned to them, to the way they inhaled his scent as if searching for weakness. Nyx took a step closer, and Dax inhaled the faintest hint of something warm and musky, like ozone and midnight air. Her kind, he recalled from the scraps of intelligence he'd gleaned during his past missions, had heightened senses. They could pick up on changes in body heat, the rapid shift of adrenaline-laced blood. But that also meant they emitted potent pheromones, ones that toyed with human biology in unpredictable ways. He was trying to ignore it, the subtle swirl of dizziness that accompanied each breath. If he acknowledged it, he'd risk giving them an edge. "I've never met a human who lasted this long in our corridors," Nyx said, taking another step, letting her voice wrap around him. "Usually they scream or they run. I'm not most humans," he said. His hand hovered near the hilt of a knife, strapped to his thigh. "You want me? Come and get me." A faint hiss emanated from the warriors behind Nyx. They seemed torn between wanting to strike and wanting to watch. Nyx gave them a brief glance, a silent command that kept them at bay, then flicked her gaze back to him. A small gesture made the chain of black metal adorning her hips glint in the flickering light. Dax's mind traced over her form. Tight, black leather-like material formed a revealing outfit, straps crisscrossing her torso, accentuating the definition of her limbs. The effect was predatory, primal, a testament to her species' lethal grace. He might have stood there all night, defying them with that unwavering stare, had the station not given a jolting shudder. Something exploded deeper within the facility, a muffled detonation that reverberated up the corridors. Several of the alien huntresses turned their heads, ears flattening momentarily. Dax didn't flinch. Instead, he used that small moment of distraction to spring forward, launching himself toward Nyx with the speed he'd honed through years of combat. Surprise flashed in her eyes. She dodged, but not quickly enough to avoid his grasp. His hand closed around her forearm. The contact sent a jolt through both of them. Her skin was alarmingly warm, and there was a raw power in the corded muscles beneath that exotic flesh. She let out a growl, hooking one leg around his and driving him off balance. They twisted together, each trying to gain the upper hand. The corridor lights strobed, illuminating the lethal dance. Her companions snarled, advancing to help, but Nyx barked a sharp command in their tongue and they hesitated. Dax nearly got the tip of his knife to her throat, but she pivoted, twisting her body like a cat, and sent a precise elbow into his ribs. Pain flared, but he clung to her, determined not to let her slip away. They collided against the wall, his cheek pressed momentarily to hers, and he felt her breath hot on his ear. He inhaled reflexively, catching a potent wave of her scent. His head swam for an instant, some primal part of him wanting to lose himself in that fierce closeness. She must have sensed his hesitation. She used it to shove him back. He stumbled, managed to keep his footing, then found himself facing not one but 4 of the huntresses fanned out around him. Nyx lifted her chin, regarding him with unreadable eyes. He noticed how she, too, was breathing harder than before, as though that brief tussle had awakened something in her she wasn't expecting. The other warriors moved in, but she raised a hand. Her command was absolute. Before he could strike again, a heavy blow from behind connected with his shoulder. One of them had circled around, ignoring her silent order. White-hot pain shot through him as he staggered to one knee. The corridor spun. He tasted copper on his tongue, coughed out a swear. His vision blurred for a split second, enough for them to overwhelm him, pinning his arms. He struggled, furious, at himself for letting them get the drop on him. But then Nyx was in front of him again, fingers lifting his chin so he was forced to look into her eyes. They glowed with a fierce, predatory light. "You're different," she murmured, her voice still holding a note of that purr. Most would have been cowering by now. "I can feel your heart racing. I can practically taste your anger." He spat blood to the side, not giving her the satisfaction of a direct response. Instead, he stared back with that same lethal calm, ignoring the throbbing pain in his muscles. There was something deeply unsettling about how captivating her face was, a warrior's angular beauty matched with the intangible aura of a stalking tigress. He had faced many foes, but none had looked at him with such brazen curiosity, as though he were an enigma to be unraveled. "Throw him in the holding bay," she ordered then, stepping back, adjusting a stray lock of hair that had fallen across her cheek. Her subordinates tightened their hold on his arms. "And keep an eye on him. Something tells me he won't stay contained for long." He felt himself hauled to his feet. The station rumbled again, signaling further structural instability, or more distant explosions. As the group guided him down the corridor, his mind raced. How had he ended up in this mess? It started with a simple reconnaissance mission to salvage data from the station, rumored to be overrun by an unknown alien species. His team had been picked off one by one, separated or killed in the gloom. He alone had made it deeper into the complex, investigating the source of a strange biological signature. That was when the parasite attacked, launching itself from the shadows. He'd killed it, but not before it bit him, and now it seemed every alien here was reacting to him in a way that defied normal logic. His captors led him to a large chamber with flickering overhead lights. The floor was scattered with debris, broken metal containers, half-melted cables, and a faint, acrid smell of burnt plastic. They shoved him inside a containment field, a shimmering energy barrier that would theoretically keep him confined. He crashed to his knees on the hard floor, head bowed, breathing ragged. Part of him wanted to claw at the wound on his arm, to see if he could tear out whatever poison was inside him, but he suspected it was far beyond that. The infection had already woven itself into his bloodstream. His eyes flicked up. On the other side of the barrier, Nyx stood with her arms crossed, flanked by 2 huntresses. She was watching him more closely now, as if studying a rare beast that she couldn't decide to slay or spare. He forced a smirk onto his face, ignoring the sweat beading at his temples. "You want to keep me in here?" he said finally, letting scorn drip from his voice. "I thought your kind preferred to chase." Her lips twitched in a slight smile. "We do," she said, taking a step closer to the barrier. "But sometimes anticipation is more fun." He ground his teeth, turning his face away. The energy barrier hummed, filling the chamber with an uncomfortable static charge. He'd need a plan to escape. These aliens clearly wanted something from him, or they wouldn't have let him live. The question was how to turn that to his advantage. The station shuddered again. A distant roar indicated something catastrophic was happening deeper inside. He suspected that if he stayed here, he'd die with the rest. But the alternative was to escape, only to be relentlessly hunted across every corridor. When the overhead lights blinked out for a moment, leaving everything bathed in the dull red glow of emergency beacons, Nyx let out a hiss of displeasure. She glanced at one of her subordinates. "Check the power relays. If they fail completely, we lose containment, and I'm not in the mood to chase him in the dark, at least, not yet." The other warrior nodded and jogged off. That left Nyx and one of her loyal watchers lingering by the barrier. Dax pressed a palm to the shimmering field, feeling the buzz of energy vibrate through him. His mouth set in a firm line. He wondered if the parasite's presence would affect the barrier. Maybe, given enough time, it would short out. Or perhaps it would kill him before that could happen. Nyx's eyes raked over him again. She seemed caught between wanting to tear him apart and something else that made her hesitate. He didn't blame her. The others had shown that same subtle enthrallment, as though the parasite's infection was giving off an irresistible chemical signal. It was no comfort to him. If anything, it made his skin crawl. Yet, amid that revulsion, a small, treacherous part of him couldn't help noticing how compelling she was, how every movement of her body seemed designed to either entice or strike fear. He shook the thought away. He'd come here for a mission, and that mission had turned into a nightmare. There'd be time for introspection if he survived. Finally, Nyx turned to leave. Before she did, she glanced over her shoulder, meeting his gaze. The moment lengthened. No words exchanged, but the charged tension between them was undeniable. Then she was gone, striding out of the chamber. The barrier hummed, leaving him trapped. He exhaled a long breath, shoulders sagging slightly. He wasn't sure how he'd fight his way out of this, but he knew one thing. Surrender was not an option. He tested the barrier again, pressing a little harder. The burn along his arm throbbed, reminding him that time was running against him. Whatever effect the parasite was having on the aliens, it might worsen in him. For a fleeting moment, he imagined how the rest of this station might look. He envisioned the corridors beyond, the huntresses waiting like prowling cats in the gloom. In his mind, he saw Nyx's eyes glowing with that predatory intensity. Oddly, the thought of her footsteps echoing after him in a chase made his pulse skitter. He cursed softly to himself. He refused to give in to whatever bizarre link might be forming. He'd get out, find a way to purge this venom, complete his mission if it was still possible, and get off this damn station. Everything else, that strange pull, was secondary. The minutes dragged by. He listened to the faint hum of machines, the occasional chatter of the feline huntresses outside. They spoke in their own language mostly, sharp syllables that pricked his ears with a sense of danger. When Nyx's voice occasionally cut in, he felt a subtle thrill, a combination of wariness and adrenaline. It felt like waiting in the ring for the next round of a brutal fight. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the chamber again, more intense this time. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the emergency lights flickered. The energy field surrounding him flickered too, dimming momentarily before flaring back to life. He tensed, seeing a chance. If the station's power supply took another hit, that barrier might fail. He could slip out in the chaos. He rose to his feet, every muscle coiled with anticipation, ignoring the pain radiating in his shoulder. He wasn't sure if anyone was watching. If he was lucky, the flicker had gone unnoticed. If he was unlucky, they'd be preparing for him to attempt an escape. He edged along the perimeter, feeling carefully for weaknesses in the energy field. It was uniformly thick, though, with no obvious breaks. Outside the barrier, the single huntress left on guard duty was pacing. She didn't look in his direction, but he guessed her ears were trained on his slightest movement. Another jolt rocked the station, and for 2 heartbeats the lights and barrier cut out altogether. He braced himself, ready to move, but the field snapped back on almost instantly, crackling so close to his face that he jerked back to avoid being singed. Frustration clenched at his gut. There had to be another way, some moment of weakness, or an act of sabotage. He scanned the chamber, searching for anything that could help. He spotted several battered crates, a half-sparking control console, a tangle of severed cables dangling from the ceiling, but nothing that screamed immediate opportunity. Behind him, the barrier hummed relentlessly, like a predator's cage. Time stretched. He counted the faint tremors in the station's infrastructure, each one potentially bringing down more sections. He remembered the mission briefing, a research vessel that had gone dark, rumored to have discovered an unknown alien species with advanced biological warfare capabilities. That must have been how the Parasite ended up here, some twisted experiment. Gone rogue. Now he was infected, and the entire species of feline-like warriors seemed entranced by something in his blood. He sank to a crouch, letting the adrenaline ebb just enough for his mind to clear. He had to stay sharp. Once they decided to move him or interrogate him, that might be his shot at freedom. He grinned without humor. They might regret not killing him outright. He'd make sure of it. When Nyx eventually returned, she came with 2 more of her huntresses in tow. One had a fresh gash across her upper arm, suggesting some recent skirmish. The other clutched a small data pad, tapping furiously. Nyx halted before the barrier, letting her gaze sweep over him again. He couldn't tell if she was disappointed or pleased that he was still there, perhaps both. "Power relays are failing," she said, not to him directly, but in a voice loud enough for him to hear. "We have to move." Her gaze flicked to him. "He comes with us, I have questions." The huntresses exchanged a look. Dax realized that maybe not all of them agreed with her, but Nyx was clearly in charge. One pressed a button on her wrist device, and the energy barrier crackled. Out of existence. Dax rose in an instant, fists clenching. He half expected them to attack. Instead, they advanced carefully. Nyx leveled a warning look at him, her pupils dilating in a way that made him think of a cat about to spring. He held himself still, letting them close in with restraints that looked like manacles of alien origin. The metal locked around his wrists, humming with a faint vibrational frequency that tingled along his skin. "You'll regret this," he murmured, voice low. Nyx's lips curved. "We'll see." They marched him out of the chamber, deeper into the station's twisting corridors. He noticed how the others cast furtive glances at him, nostrils flaring as though inhaling his scent. Their uneasy expressions told him they felt something unusual that they couldn't quite name, an undeniable pull emanating from him like a siren call. But they also kept their weapons close, tails swishing in agitation. He considered making a break for it, but with his wrists bound and the corridor swarming with armed warriors, it would be suicidal. He was forced to cooperate, at least for now. They descended through half-lit passageways, stepping over rubble and debris, until the environment opened into a large bay that must once have been a cargo hold. Flickering lights revealed half-devoured crates, scorch marks from laser blasts, and large smears of a thick purple fluid that might have been alien blood. Nyx led them to a rusted metal console on one side of the bay. She keyed in a few commands, cursing under her breath when an error message glowed red on the cracked screen. Sparks erupted from a panel overhead. The entire station let out another groan, more severe than before, making them stumble. "We can't stay here," one of the huntresses urged, clearly agitated. "This place is coming apart." Nyx's tail lashed. "We need the data from the labs below. That's our real prize." Then, almost reluctantly, she turned her attention to Dax. And him. He watched her, reading the frustration etched in her features. She glanced at him, as if he might have an answer. Maybe she suspected he knew more about the station's failing systems. He gave a slow shrug, ignoring the ache in his shoulders. "The lower levels are where your problem started," he said quietly. "You want to dig up more trouble?" Nyx scoffed, but seemed interested. "You speak as if you know something." Only that an alien parasite came from down there and it bit me. Look around. Does any of this suggest a safe treasure hunt? Her eyes narrowed. Another tremor rocked the bay, sending a distant rattle through the walls. For a split second, Dax thought the floor might give way. The lights flickered, the overhead beams moaning. Nyx cursed in her language, pacing away from the console. The other huntresses exchanged uneasy glances, and one said something in a hushed tone that Dax couldn't quite catch. Nyx inhaled, then faced Dax again. I didn't ask for a lecture, human, but she was clearly thinking. He could see that she wasn't one to throw caution to the wind without weighing her options. He was also noticing how her gaze flicked to his arm, the place where the parasite had left its mark, and how her pupils seemed to dilate every time she looked at him. She was fighting an inner battle, one that made her short-tempered. He let a ghost of a smirk curl his lip. You should probably hurry before this station tears itself apart. By all means, lead on. Nyx snarled in annoyance, stepping closer, close enough that he could smell the electric charge in her breath again. Keep your tone in check, she warned, or I'll throw you to the ones who don't have my restraint. Dax met her, glare, neither submitting nor challenging her further. She let out a dismissive growl and turned to her warriors. We'll move. The labs are our priority. She gestured to the restraints, and keep him on a short leash. They moved out, forging deeper into the station. The corridors grew darker and the damage more severe. Occasionally, a panel on the wall would explode in a shower of sparks, causing the group to duck and weave. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floor was littered with broken equipment. Despite the swirling chaos, Dax could sense the disquiet among the huntresses. Their eyes flicked toward him again and again, as if drawn by a force they couldn't resist. One even brushed by him deliberately, inhaling deeply near his neck. He jerked away, unsettled by the closeness. Nyx kept to the front, leading them, confidently. Her strides were long, predatory, balanced. She navigated the debris with an ease that spoke of extensive combat training. Dax was grudgingly impressed. She reminded him of a black panther he'd seen once on a deep jungle mission. Graceful, stealthy, and unquestionably dangerous. He took note of the small details that might give him an edge, how her shoulders shifted when she was about to move, the way she flicked her tail when frustrated. She might have her own brand of vulnerabilities. They reached a large, sealed door that bore the insignia of a human research team, now peeling and burned. Nyx nodded to one of her subordinates, who stepped forward to manipulate a control panel. A hiss of steam escaped as the door groaned open, revealing a corridor bathed in ominous red emergency lighting. A smell of rot and stale air washed over them, making more than one huntress wrinkle her nose. Dax felt his stomach twist. This had to be where the parasite was contained originally, or at least where the research had been done. If more of those creatures were lurking here, they might not be alone. The group advanced cautiously, scanning corners with handheld devices. The tension in the air ratcheted higher with each step, as if they were all collectively holding their breath. He noticed that whenever Nyx paused to check a corner, she'd glance back at him, her eyes flicking across his form. There was a question in her expression. She was measuring him, possibly waiting to see if the parasite's influence would manifest in some dangerous way. He kept his face impassive. He didn't have answers. The infection was there, burning just beneath his skin, but aside from the occasional wave of dizziness or the odd sense of heightened awareness, he couldn't tell what else it was doing. They passed through a shattered security checkpoint, stepping over the twisted remains of automated defense turrets. Then they came to a set of large windows, looking into a wide laboratory chamber. Beyond the glass, tables and containment units lay in disarray, vials shattered on the floor, fluid smeared across metal surfaces. A flickering overhead lamp cast eerie shadows on the walls, showing signs of a struggle. Claw marks, broken lab. Instruments. Something monstrous had happened here. Nyx lifted a hand, signaling the group to halt. Her tail flicked anxiously. She pressed a button on the panel to open the lab door, but a warning sign flashed in the alien language on her device. Sealed from the inside, she muttered. Emergency lockdown. One of the huntresses raised a compact weapon, aiming to blast the lock open. Nyx motioned her to wait. She peered through the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. Dax stepped. up behind her, ignoring the hiss from the guard who held his restraints. He wanted a better look, too. He could make out a shape in the corner, something moving, quivering. It looked vaguely humanoid but twisted, as if partially dissolved. A tendril or appendage reached out, scraping the floor. He swallowed, a cold sweat breaking across his forehead. He recognized that shape from the partial mission briefing. Researchers had been experimenting on an organism. If it had metamorphosed or merged with one of the scientists, that meant danger beyond just the feline huntresses. This was a threat to them all, possibly the entire station. Nyx seemed to realize the same thing. She stepped back, pressing her lips together in a tight line. "We should blast it," one huntress growled, ears flat. "Destroy whatever is in there." But Nyx hesitated, glancing at Dax. "This might be the source of the data we came for." She turned to him, speaking softly. "You wouldn't happen to know anything that would help us get inside, would you?" He met her gaze, aware of the layer of challenge in her tone. She was offering him a chance to prove useful. He considered for a moment. If the lockdown is active, it means the system is still running on emergency power. Someone must have triggered a quarantine protocol. He glanced at the twisted figure inside the lab. Could be that poor soul tried to contain themselves before it was too late. Nyx stared at him, measuring his words. Another tremor rattled. The corridor. A panel overhead sparked, raining down a shower of hot fragments. The group flinched but maintained formation. Time was running out. "Fine," Nyx said. "We'll do it your way. Show me how to override it." He lifted his bound wrists. "Hard to do anything with these on." She bared her teeth, a silent snarl of warning. "Don't try to run." He gave a curt nod. She motioned for the guard to release him, and the manacles clicked open, dropping into the guard's waiting hands. Dax flexed his wrists, ignoring the subtle relief that washed over him. He stepped toward the control panel by the door, scanning the lines of text that flashed across the cracked screen. It was a hybrid of human code and the station's system. He recognized some emergency override commands. Tapping at the panel, he input a sequence that forced a manual reboot. Lights blinked, then a hiss escaped the door's seal. "There," he said, "but it'll open in lockdown mode, so you'll have to be ready." Nyx nodded at her warriors, and they raised their weapons. The door slid open, revealing the lab in full. The stench hit them like a wall, decay, chemicals, and something acid, like a burnt metallic tang. The shape in the corner stirred, letting out a wet gurgling noise. Dax's stomach lurched. Whatever was left of the scientist had been partially absorbed by the parasite's mass. A pulsating growth clung to the figure's torso, sprouting tendrils that slithered across the floor. "Ancestors preserve us," one huntress muttered in her own tongue, stepping back in horror. Nyx aimed a specialized rifle, hand tense on the trigger. The creature whipped a tendril toward them, spattering noxious fluid across the floor. Dax leaped aside, heart pounding. For a moment, the creature's single visible eye focused on him, and he felt an eerie recognition, as though it sensed the same infection in his body. Then one of the huntresses opened fire, scorching the beast with a beam of superheated energy. It shrieked, flailing violently. Nyx joined in, peppering it with blasts. Dax stayed low, scanning for cover. The parasite flung a tendril at a table, snapping it in half. Liquid spilled across the floor, sizzling as it melted the metal plating. The group spread out, forming a strategic perimeter. Dax, unarmed, moved behind an overturned console, searching for any kind of weapon. He spotted a metal rod lying next to a severed hand. He tried not to look too closely at the remains. Grabbing the rod, he gritted his teeth. It was better than nothing. The shrieking escalated, echoing in the enclosed lab. The parasite's body convulsed, blackening from the barrage of alien plasma rounds. Yet it refused to die. Dax realized it might be regenerating. In the corner, the twisted scientist's face contorted in agony, as if still conscious despite everything. A wave of revulsion washed over Dax, but he forced himself to focus. The creature recognized the same infection in him, and it was reacting. Maybe that meant he could distract it. He stood up, ignoring the lines of feral energy coursing through his arm. He banged the rod against a metal table, drawing its attention. The half-merged head jerked toward him with a gargled snarl. Dax sneered. "Over here, you monstrosity." It lurched forward, dragging itself across the floor in a violent frenzy. Nix shot him a furious look. He was putting himself in danger. But he knew that if they kept blasting it aimlessly, it might take too long to kill. The station was collapsing around them. He circled wide, leading the monster away from the core of the group, giving them a clearer shot. One tendril lashed out, raking the air mere inches from his chest. He dodged, slammed the rod down on it, pinning it against the floor. Another huntress fired again, scorching the mass near its center. Smoke rose as the parasite's flesh burned. Dax clenched his jaw, pushing all his strength onto the rod, trying to keep it from ripping free. But it was strong, inhumanly so. It jerked once, flinging him backward. He tumbled across the floor, losing his grip. But that moment of vulnerability gave Nix a clear shot at its core. She fired in a rapid sequence of controlled bursts, each blast shaking the lab. The creature let out a keening wail, its body convulsing as lumps of charred tissue splattered the walls. At last it collapsed, sagging into a steaming pile of blackened flesh. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. Then the remains twitched. Once more, but only in a final death spasm settling into stillness. Dax picked himself up, wincing at new bruises. The acrid smell of burnt parasite filled his nostrils. He saw Nix lower her weapon, her breathing ragged. The rest of her warriors stared at the corpse with a mixture of disgust and relief. One stepped forward, scanning it with a device. The reading flickered across the screen, showing the parasite's vital signs flatlining. "That was messy," Nix said, turning to Dax. She looked him up and down, assessing. "You're not injured?" He grimaced, rubbing his sore shoulder. "I've been worse." Their eyes locked, and he noticed how her pupils flared for a split second. She seemed to be fighting an internal battle, likely the same unstoppable attraction that had crept into the others. He wondered if she hated it. Her expression suggested she did. He refused to break the gaze first, letting her see that he wasn't some feeble captive. Something like grudging respect sparked in her eyes. Another tremor rocked the lab, making them all stumble. The overhead lamp swung dangerously, sputtering. Some of the floor panels started to buckle. It felt like the entire station was groaning under the weight of catastrophic damage. "We have what we need," Nix said, though it sounded uncertain. "Scan the terminals, download anything left on the parasite's research. Then we leave." Dax wiped sweat from his brow. "And me? You gonna leave me to rot?" Nix angled her head, that predatory half-smile touching her lips again. "You're coming with us. I'm not done with you yet." He could hear the low growl in her tone, sense the tension that layered her words. Part of him bristled at the idea of being dragged along, but another part recognized this as a chance, maybe his only chance, to get out alive. He nodded carefully. They moved into action. Several huntresses fanned out, searching for portable data drives or sealed containers that might hold relevant research. Dax took the opportunity to grab a battered sidearm from a broken security desk, tucking it into his waistband. One of the huntresses snarled a warning when she saw, but Nix raised a hand for her to let it be, as if acknowledging that he was more of an ally than a threat at that moment. In the corner, the remains of the scientist-turned-parasite host lay in a steaming mass. Dax tore his gaze away, trying not to dwell on how that might be his fate if he didn't find a way to stop the infection. He glanced at Nix. "You said you had questions about this." He gestured to his arm, the place where the bite still throbbed. "You want answers? Then hurry up, I might not have much time." She glared at him, but there was a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes. "Don't you die before I get what I want," she said, voice low. The tension in the room was thick, not just from the fight, but from the unspoken charge between them. It was as if each near-death moment only fueled the strange connection. Dax refused to acknowledge it openly, but he couldn't deny the subtle pounding in his chest whenever she got too close. The entire station seemed to close in around them, forcing them into a high-stakes dance of survival. One false step, and they'd all be buried under metal and flame. The huntresses finished their hurried data grab. Their device beeped, indicating a partial success. Nix frowned, scanning the readout. Then she motioned for everyone to move out. "We have to get to the extraction point," she said. "Our vessel is docked in the central hangar. If it's still intact, we can escape before—" "This entire place collapses," Dax nodded. "Lead the way." They didn't bother rebinding him, there was no time. The group exited the lab, stepping back into the corridor. Another explosion rattled the walls, this time louder and more resonant. Emergency lights blinked, then went out entirely, plunging everything into near-complete darkness, save for the occasional spark or flicker of a console. The huntresses clicked on small handheld illuminators, beams cutting through the dust-laden air. They picked up the pace, jogging through twisting hallways. Dax stayed near Nyx, partly because her presence kept the others from trying to restrain him, and partly because, despite everything, he felt safer near the apex predator of this band. She moved with a tense urgency, scanning each intersection. For danger. He could almost hear her heart pounding in sync with his own. As they neared the central hangar, the station's structural instability reached a crescendo. Beams fell from the ceiling, smashing into the floors with thunderous clangs. Vents spewed bursts of black smoke. One corridor collapsed behind them with a deafening roar, cutting off any retreat. Dax's adrenaline spiked, fueling him to press on despite fatigue. When they finally burst into the hangar, the sight that greeted them was chaotic. Part of the ceiling had collapsed onto a row of smaller craft. Flames licked at torn metal hulls, and the stench of burnt wiring choked the air. On the far side, barely visible through the haze, sat a sleek alien vessel that must belong to Nyx's group, a dark, angular ship that appeared battered but possibly operational. Nyx gestured to it, calling for her warriors to form a defensive perimeter. Dax followed her across the hangar floor. They had to duck under fallen support beams, stepping gingerly over flickering flames. One huntress tried to jump a gap in the floor where it had split open, lost her footing, and tumbled into the darkness below with a short cry. Another warrior cursed, rushing to the edge, but it was too late. The station claimed another victim. Nyx clenched her teeth, ears flattening in grim determination. Dax reached the ramp leading up into their vessel. He paused, glancing back. Nyx was fending off a sudden ambush, two more of her kind, but wearing a different style of armor. Rivals, it seemed, had arrived. They must have tried to seize control of the ship. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air. Nyx darted behind a pile of crates, returning fire with lethal precision. The muzzle flash lit her features, revealing a snarl that bared her fangs. Dax realized she might not make it aboard without backup. He gritted his teeth. The wise move was to run for the ship, but something about the raw determination in her eyes made him hesitate. Against his better judgment, he sprinted back into the fray. The sidearm he'd taken from the lab felt strange in his hand, but it fired well enough. He let off 3 quick shots, forcing the rival warriors to duck. That gave Nyx room to vault over the crates, delivering a savage kick that sent one sprawling. She dispatched the second with a precise blast to the chest. Another explosion rocked the hangar, sending chunks of concrete raining down. Dax shielded his head with an arm. Nyx grabbed his wrist, pulling him toward the ramp. "Move!" she shouted, eyes blazing. Together, they stumbled inside the alien vessel. The ramp retracted, sealing them in. Alarm klaxons wailed, and the floor trembled once more. From a corridor ahead, they heard the shouts of other huntresses securing compartments. The engines roared to life. "Strap in, human," Nyx snarled, pushing him toward a seat in what appeared to be the cargo bay. "If we fail to break free, at least you'll die quickly." He buckled himself in, adrenaline still surging. He glanced at her through the gloom, noticing the sheen of sweat on her skin and the rise and fall of her chest as she caught her breath. She was battered, a fresh cut marking her shoulder, yet still imposing, still the apex hunter. The faint hum that passed between them was impossible to ignore. She turned away, barking orders into a comm device. The engines whined, powering up. A final quake shook the vessel violently as the station seemed to implode around them. Then the ship lurched, thrusters engaging, and they shot out into the vacuum of space. For several moments there was only the sound of engine strain and frantic systems checks. Once the relative stillness of space enveloped them, the realization set in they'd escaped, but at great cost. At least half the huntresses were unaccounted for. The black void outside the viewport flickered with debris from the disintegrating station. Nix and the survivors began checking one another's wounds, exchanging terse words. Dax sat in silence, unbuckling himself at last. He could barely believe he was still alive. Nix stalked over to him, standing above where he was seated. She breathed heavily, tail lashing in agitation. "You saved me back there," she said quietly, as though the admission displeased her. He shrugged. "I figured you were more use." "Alive?" Her eyes narrowed, but that faint predatory smile returned. She flicked her gaze over his form again, lingering on the area where the parasite bit him. Then she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper. "Don't think it means I trust you." He felt a spark of defiance. "I wouldn't dream of it." She lingered a heartbeat longer, letting tension crackle between them, then withdrew with a curt nod. "Get some rest, human. We're not done." He watched her leave, feeling the unresolved charge in the air. His heart still thudded in his chest, and every muscle felt wired with an energy he couldn't shake. The parasite's infection was more than just a burn. It was a bond that tied him to these deadly felines, and to Nix most of all. Despite the fear, he couldn't deny the electric thrill that came with every clash of wills between them. He wondered, for a fleeting moment, what she was feeling. She was the one in command, but something about him was starting to disrupt her iron control. He saw it in the way her gaze lingered, the subtle hitch in her breath. Maybe, just maybe, he could use that to his advantage, or it might consume them both. He couldn't decide which was more likely. For now he settled back, letting the roar of the ship's engines fade to a distant hum as they soared away from the wreckage of the station and into the unknown. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but one thing was certain. Whatever the parasite had awakened, it was only getting stronger. And the entire alien cat species seemed unable to resist the lure that now pulsed in his veins. He sat in the cargo bay with his back against a bulkhead, swallowing a mouthful of stale air from the ship's recycled oxygen. The hum of the engines was steady now, a comforting monotony after the chaos they'd escaped. A handful of the feline, warriors paced restlessly, casting sidelong glances in his direction. He could feel their tension. Most of them were still trying to resist whatever strange magnetism emanated from him. It set him on edge, too. Being the object of their predatory focus was less than reassuring. A clang echoed down the corridor. As Nix returned, her stride purposeful. She stopped in front of him, arms folded across her chest. 2 huntresses trailed her, though they kept a respectful distance. "You're coming with me," she said, voice lacking the soft purr from earlier. This was a command. "We have questions about what happened on that station." He glared up at her but pushed himself to his feet. "Fine, you ask, I answer, within reason." One of the huntresses let out a low hiss, but Nix flicked her tail in a dismissive gesture, silencing the underling. She turned on her heel, and he followed her down a dimly lit corridor that led to what looked like a small briefing room. Once inside, she sealed the door behind them, leaving them alone. The space was cramped, a circular table in the center with several seats. She stood, on the opposite side of the table, still exuding that fierce aura of command. "I want to know what the humans were doing on that station," she said. "The research, the parasite, everything." He considered how much to reveal. The mission had been classified, but the entire operation was now destroyed, and the parasite was widespread. Maybe honesty could buy him some leverage. "They were investigating a new life form discovered on the fringes of human territory," he explained slowly. "It proved dangerous, fast to adapt and extremely aggressive. Some of the more reckless scientists wanted to harness it as a weapon." Nix's eyes narrowed. "A weapon?" He nodded grimly. "You saw what it could do. Merge with a host, take over their body, transform them into something monstrous. It can also exude a powerful chemical that influences certain species. Humans are susceptible, but apparently your kind reacts to it even more strongly." Her jaw tightened and she looked momentarily unsettled. "That explains why every warrior within a kilometer of you seems distracted. We've never encountered a substance that could turn our own instincts against us. My kind are natural predators. We don't typically fixate like this." He crossed his arms. "Trust me, it's not a pleasant experience on my end either." She stepped closer to the table. The low lighting accentuated the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the curve of her lips. She was undeniably striking, but he forced himself not to dwell on that. Instead, he watched how her pupils seemed to dilate whenever she glanced at him, a sure sign of the parasite's subtle hold. She took a breath, as if steeling herself. "Is there a cure?" she asked. "None that I know of. We'd only just discovered it ourselves. The main reason I went to that station was to retrieve data that might have led to a cure. But it looks like everything's gone." Her tail swished in agitation. "So I'm stuck with a wounded human who can bring my entire species to its knees just by existing, that's what you're telling me?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "I'm stuck with being your prisoner, don't forget that part." They stared at each other in tense silence, the hum of the engines pulsing beneath their feet. Eventually, she let out a low sigh. "This changes things. My people. We are already fractured by internal power struggles. If word gets out that you're carrying something that can manipulate us, you'll be hunted by every clan seeking an advantage." His mouth quirked. "Already am, from what I can tell." She nodded, grim. "I'm not sure whether to keep you close or dispose of you before this spirals out of control." He felt a surge of alarm, but kept his face impassive. "Killing me might not stop it. For all we know, it could transfer even after my death." "That's a risk I can't ignore," she said, voice clipped. She paced a few steps, one hand resting on the hilt of a sidearm at her hip. The tension coiled in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then she exhaled slowly, removing her hand from the weapon. "We need more information. The data we salvaged might hold clues to containing this parasite." He inclined his head, seeing a sliver of opportunity. "If you want my help decoding it, you'll keep me alive." Her gaze flicked to him. "Precisely." She motioned for him to follow, stepping out of the briefing room and leading him through narrow corridors to another part of the ship. The lights flickered as they passed. He could sense the wariness of the huntresses they passed. Some glared, others averted their eyes as if the mere sight of him might trigger something unmanageable. He maintained a stoic front. When they arrived at a small lab station, likely the ship's best attempt at a research bay, several warriors were clustered around a console displaying lines of code. They hissed in frustration, tapping keys with sharp claws. Nix gestured for Dax to approach. "Your people's language might be easier for you to parse," she said. He nodded, stepping up to the console. The data was fragmented, lines of corrupted text interspersed with bits of scientific notes on the parasite's life cycle. He recognized terms he'd seen in the mission briefings, references to genetic splicing, immunoresponse thresholds, something about pheromone amplification. His mind worked quickly, piecing together the puzzle. Most was incomplete. It seemed like the final set of files needed were never fully uploaded. Nix hovered behind him, close enough that he felt the faint heat of her body. She peered at the screen. "Can you make sense of it?" He shrugged, typing commands to decrypt and reformat sections of the text. "Some of it. The rest might be lost." He pointed to a passage about pheromonal receptors. "This bit describes how the parasite's venom interacts with certain species' pheromone receptors. It essentially flips them into overdrive, causing an irresistible attraction response. Seems your biology is particularly sensitive." She let out a soft growl, and he half expected her to lash out at him in anger. Instead, she took a measured breath. "Then it might be possible to block those receptors." He frowned, scanning the next lines of code. "If we had the right compounds, maybe. But I'm not a scientist. My expertise is infiltration, combat. This is advanced genetic manipulation." One of the huntresses hissed behind them, tail flicking. "So we're stuck with him?" Nix shot her a glare that made the subordinate lower her head. Then she turned back to Dax. "If we can't fix it, we'll need to hide it until we find a solution, which means you stay on this ship under my control." He set his jaw, about to protest, but something in her expression stopped him. She looked genuinely uneasy, a mix of anger and uncertainty. He realized that despite her command over these warriors, she was wrestling with a responsibility she hadn't asked for. The station mission had turned into an outright fiasco. He was merely the living embodiment of that problem. He tried to lighten the mood slightly. At least you won't be bored. Her eyes flashed dangerously, but then she seemed to consider his words. There was no malice in his tone, just a wry acceptance of their predicament. She straightened her shoulders. I have duties to attend to. Keep working on that data. Maybe you'll find something useful. She turned and left, her tail swishing behind her. The other huntresses glowered at him, but obeyed her order not to interfere. He returned his attention to the console, ignoring the tingling sensation where the parasite's bite scar still burned. He typed command after command, trying to piece together any clue that might help them. A part of him realized that he was working for them, his captors, but the alternative was to remain ignorant of his own condition. He had to know more. As the minutes stretched on, the tension in the small lab space became increasingly uncomfortable. He could feel the eyes of the huntresses on him, the way they occasionally inhaled as if testing his scent. Whatever weird hold the parasite had, it was growing stronger, or at least more noticeable. He forced himself to focus on the glowing lines of text. Every so often he found references to an inoculation prototype, but the details were missing or corrupted. Eventually, the quiet hiss of the door sliding open made him glance up. Nyx re-entered, stepping carefully into the cramped room. The other huntresses watched her warily. She lifted a hand, dismissing them. They left one by one until it was just the two of them again. Dax felt his pulse quicken, unsure if it was from the parasite or his own curiosity. She approached the console, ignoring personal space as she leaned in, scanning what he'd uncovered. The overhead lights cast a warm glow over her features, highlighting the subtle lines of tension in her jaw and the elegant curve of her ears. He realized she was close enough that he could see a faint quiver in her pupils. She was fighting the lure. "Found anything?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. He cleared his throat. "Just scraps. The scientists were close to a breakthrough on a blocker, but the data is incomplete." She let out a frustrated exhale. "Figures." A silence fell between them, heavy and charged. He noticed the slight flare of her nostrils, the almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she braced it on the console's edge. This wasn't just about the data anymore. The tension coiling between them had grown palpable, like a live wire. He averted his gaze, focusing on the screen, but the next words out of her mouth made his heart skip. "It's worse when I'm close to you," she said, so softly that he almost didn't catch it. "Like a scent that I can't ignore. I should hate it, but it's compelling." He swallowed, refusing to look at her. "Believe me, I'm not enjoying it either." She let out a low, mirthless laugh. "No. I see your pulse jumping at your throat." His jaw tightened. "That's adrenaline." "Is it?" He finally met her gaze, and the moment he did, the charged silence threatened to ignite. She was studying him like a puzzle, or prey. Her body language screamed predator, but beneath that, he sensed her confusion. He saw how her pupils dilated when she exhaled, how her collarbone rose and fell with each measured breath. He realized he was gripping the console so hard his knuckles had gone white. "It's too soon," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. "I don't lose control this easily." He didn't respond. His body felt heated, his senses attuned to every subtle movement she made. Part of him wanted to push her away, to break this oppressive tension. Another part, traitorous and unstoppable, wanted to see if that tension would snap and send them colliding together. He fought it, telling himself it was the parasite and not actual desire. She took a step closer, so near that he felt the warmth of her breath. He could see the flutter of her lashes, the faint sheen of sweat on her neck. There was no softness in her posture. Even this closeness felt like a challenge, as though she was daring him to flinch. He stood his ground, teeth clenched. Without warning, the overhead lights flickered and the ship lurched, sending him stumbling into her. She caught his shoulders, fingers digging in just enough to anchor him. For a moment, their bodies pressed together and he felt that electric jolt again, like two magnets snapping into alignment. She hissed softly, eyes flashing. Her lips were so close to his ear that he heard the sudden catch in her breath. They parted abruptly, stepping back as if scalded. The moment left them both rattled. She turned away, raking a hand through her dark hair, tail whipping in agitation. He clenched his fists, wishing he could tear this parasite out of himself and end the weird compulsion. Anything to have clarity again. A beep from the console drew their attention. Some portion of the data had finished decrypting. Nyx moved. To check it, clearly seizing on the distraction, regaining her composure. He joined her, forcing his mind back to the immediate crisis. The readout contained references to a forced proximity intensifier, suggesting that the parasite's effects magnify with close contact. Dax cursed under his breath. That explained why each time they got too near, the tension skyrocketed. It also mentioned that once infected, the host might inadvertently produce its own variant of the pheromones, creating an endless loop of attraction for susceptible species. So every minute he spent around these warriors was making it worse for everyone, including himself. Nyx read it too, brows knitting. This is dangerous. If we can't control it, it could spread chaos among my people. Wars have started over less. Entire clans could tear each other apart for a chance to harness this effect. He nodded grimly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling over him. Then you see why I can't just run loose. That's probably what your rivals wanted. Capture me. Weaponize me. She pressed her lips into a tight line. We'll have to work together to contain this. He hesitated, hearing genuine resolve in her tone. And if we can't find a cure, what then? Her eyes darted to him, flickering with an emotion he couldn't decode. Fear, determination, both. Then we'll have to keep you hidden, or kill you to keep this from spreading. He held her gaze. Would you? She didn't flinch, but neither did she confirm. They stood there in taut silence until a knock on the door broke the moment. One of her subordinates peeked in, reporting that they'd picked up a distress signal from another clan's ship. Nyx dismissed the huntress, but not before a brief conversation in their language revealed that the signal likely belonged to a rival clan known for their ruthless tactics. Looks like we have more trouble, Nyx muttered once the door shut. We can't avoid them if they're near our route. Dax took a breath. If they find me, they'll try to claim me, right? She gave a curt nod. They will. And I won't let them. Her statement hung in the air, an unexpected promise of protection, though he had no illusions it was purely altruistic. She needed him alive for her own ends. Still, it sent a strange current through him, a flicker of trust in the midst of suspicion. He hated that he felt any gratitude, but he also knew being on her side was infinitely better than the alternative. They decided to rendezvous in the ship's command center to plan their course of action. The door slid open to reveal a small but efficient bridge, staffed by a few loyal huntresses. Star charts hovered in a holographic display at the center, showing the region of space and the incoming distress beacon. Sure enough, the rival clan's ship was close. Their damaged vessel was drifting on the outskirts of a debris field, presumably having suffered some catastrophic failure. One of the huntresses hissed, "We should leave them to rot." Nyx's tail lashed. "We're not altruists, but they might have resources or information we can use, or they might become a threat if we ignore them." Dax kept his silence, letting her command. He noticed how the other huntresses deferred to her, even though tension was thick in the air whenever he was near. She pointed at the chart. Set a course. Approach slowly. Weapons primed. The group went into motion, adjusting controls. Dax found a corner to stand in, wanting to stay out of the way. He felt Nyx's gaze on him occasionally, but neither spoke. The next few minutes were a blur of readouts and urgent chatter, culminating in the view of a battered alien cruiser on the main screen. Sparks danced along its hull, and faint flickering lights indicated partial power. "We're being hailed," one huntress announced. "Audio only." Nyx narrowed her eyes. "Put it through." A harsh voice crackled over the comm in the feline language. Dax couldn't catch all of it, but the tone was urgent, pleading for assistance. Nyx responded tersely, demanding to know the clan's status. The conversation escalated quickly, with the rival captain insisting they were on the verge of total life support failure. Nyx glanced at Dax. He understood. This clan might be the type to double-cross them. But if they boarded that ship, or if the rival clan came aboard Nyx's vessel. The presence of the parasite's thrall could incite chaos. A slip of the tongue from one of her warriors, and the rival clan would learn about the human who could tip the balance of power. Tension spiked. Dax realized he might become a bargaining chip. He wondered if Nyx would keep her word to protect him. She ended the transmission, turning to her crew. "We'll board them, but only a small team. We'll assess the situation and decide if it's salvageable. If it's a trap, we'll retreat and blow their engines." Her subordinates nodded. One grinned ferally, clearly eager for a potential fight. Dax braced himself, expecting her to tell him to stay behind. Instead, she fixed him with a steely stare. "You're coming," he blinked. "Is that wise?" She lifted her chin. "Don't question me, human. You're too valuable to leave behind. If this is a trap, they'll try to seize the ship or pick us off. I want you where I can see you." He couldn't argue. Part of him expected to be locked in a cell for the mission's duration, but she was right about one thing. If he stayed behind, the risk of sabotage or betrayal was high. He clenched his jaw. "Then I'll gear up." A short while later, they stood in the docking bay of Nyx's ship, as the two vessels drifted close enough to lock airlocks. Dax wore borrowed armor that didn't fit perfectly, but was better than nothing. Nyx had chosen her best fighters, each of them eyeing him with barely contained tension. The short time he'd spent among them had amplified whatever weird compulsion the parasite induced. He swallowed, ignoring the swirl of pheromonal tension that prickled his nerves. Nyx's voice cut through the static-laden comms. "Stay close. Watch for betrayal. Move fast." The airlock doors slid open, revealing the corridors of the rival cruiser, dark, flickering emergency lights, smoke drifting across the floor. As they stepped inside, Dax felt the heaviness of possible ambush weigh on him. Nyx led the way, her silhouette sleek and predatory in the gloom. He stayed just behind her, sidearm clenched in his hand. A group of armed felines emerged from the darkness ahead, wearing similar but slightly different attire. Their faces bore the marks of desperation and hostility. Their leader stepped forward, ear flicking. A short, tense exchange in their language ensued. Dax watched Nyx's posture, cautious but not yielding an inch. He couldn't understand every word, but the gist was that they needed help repairing critical systems, or they'd all suffocate. Nyx demanded proof that it wasn't a trap. A faint clang echoed from deeper within the ship. Dax tensed. The rival leader signaled for them to follow. They maneuvered through corridors littered with debris, passing flickering consoles and bodies of the fallen. The atmosphere grew stifling, hinting that life support was indeed failing. Dax noticed how some of these rival warriors looked at him with curiosity, sniffing the air as if they caught a strange scent. He tried to keep a low profile, but the tension was impossible to hide. At last, they reached an engineering bay, where sparks rained from a half-exploded control panel. The acrid smell of burned wiring stung Dax's nostrils. Nyx checked her own device, confirming that the ship's oxygen scrubbers were nearing total collapse. One of the rival clan's engineers, a wiry female with slitted amber eyes, gestured to the ruined consoles, hissing a plea. Nyx barked an order to her own team, telling them to assess the damage. Meanwhile, Dax hung back. His gaze swept the shadows for any sign of an ambush. The constant roil of tension among these felines was thick enough to taste. He felt the heat emanating from them, noticed how their ears twitched in agitation. Whether the parasite's influence was drifting in the air or not, it was definitely saturating the moment. Suddenly, a shout rang out from one of Nyx's warriors. Dax whirled. A group of the rival clan had cornered her behind some crates, weapons drawn. The situation devolved in seconds. Plasma bolts tore through the air. Shouts echoed, half drowned by the crackling of short-circuiting panels. Dax ducked, rolling behind a piece of debris. Nyx cursed and opened fire, the muzzle flash illuminating her fierce snarl. The rival leader shouted something about taking the human alive. Dax's stomach lurched. They knew. Somehow they'd gotten wind of his value. Maybe they smelled it, or overheard a whisper. Either way, everything exploded into violence. He popped up, firing his sidearm with grim efficiency. Two of the rival warriors dropped, claws scrabbling at the deck. Another lunged at Nix from behind, but Dax shouted a warning, drawing the attacker's focus. The warrior turned on him instead. Dax met the charge with a desperate swing of a scavenged blade. Sparks flew as metal clashed with the feline's gauntlet. She snarled, pressing him back against a console. Her breath was hot, eyes wild. He shoved her off, delivered a savage elbow that dazed her, and landed a shot to the chest. She collapsed. Meanwhile, Nix's team tried to secure the area. But the rival clan had the advantage of numbers, and more were swarming in from adjacent corridors. The entire engineering bay erupted in chaos. Dax glimpsed Nix locked in hand-to-hand combat with a huge rival male. She twisted away from a blow. That would have cracked her skull, then retaliated with a lethal slash across his torso. He fell gurgling. A war cry echoed from behind Dax. He pivoted, barely lifting his weapon in time. A swirling mass of claws and teeth leaped at him. A female warrior, eyes blazing. She pinned his arm, hissed in his face. The sheer force of her presence made him dizzy. The parasite flared within him, responding to the proximity of another feline host. She shuddered, as though momentarily enthralled, and that gave him the split second he needed to wrench free and level his gun. Her eyes widened in confusion, and he fired. A final, devastating explosion rocked the chamber as something vital overloaded in the engineering bay. Flames engulfed a section of the room, forcing a retreat. Nix's voice rang out in a commanding snarl, calling her team to pull back to the corridor. Dax staggered, choking on thick smoke. He glimpsed the bodies of friend and foe alike strewn across the floor. The flickering lights and raging fire painted everything in a hellish glow. He felt a hand yank him upright. It was Nix, face soot-streaked, eyes blazing. "We have to go," she growled. "Now." He nodded, barely able to breathe. Together they stumbled through the acrid haze, retreating with the surviving members of Nix's team. Once they cleared the bay, the door sealed behind them, muffling the roar of flames. The rival clan had been decimated in their ambush, but so had Nix's. Only a handful of them remained standing. Coughing, Dax leaned against the corridor wall. Nix glared at him, panting, fur matted with sweat where it showed beneath her armor. "They knew," she spat. "They tried to take you." He rubbed his chest, lungs burning. "Seems word travels fast." She pounded a fist against the wall, tail lashing in fury. "This is exactly what I feared." Her gaze raked over him, lingering on the line of fresh blood on his cheek, a shallow cut from that scuffle. She inhaled sharply, as if the scent was driving her mad. Damn this parasite! Her subordinates looked equally rattled, glancing warily at Dax. He wiped the blood away, noticing how their eyes tracked his every movement. The corridor lights flickered again, highlighting the battered, exhausted warriors. Not much remained to salvage here, except the knowledge that any clan who caught wind of his presence would attempt the same. The entire species could be turned upside down if they realized a living conduit of the parasite's effect was out there. "We've done what we can," Nix said bitterly, glaring at the sealed engineering bay. "They're doomed." Indeed. The rival ship's systems had collapsed into ruin. The lights flickered ominously. "Let's get back to our vessel." They raced through the corridors, alert for more ambushes. Bodies littered the floor, but no further threats emerged. The docking tube was clear. By the time they sealed the airlock behind them and re-entered Nix's ship, the rival cruiser was likely beyond salvation. Nix's eyes blazed with anger, frustration, and something else, an undercurrent of protective wrath that vibrated in her voice. "We leave now," she told her pilot. "Plot a course away from any known clan territories. We need time to recover." The pilot complied. Engines roared, and they drifted free from the ravaged cruiser. Dax watched through a viewport as it faded into the void, a lost cause. Inside him, the parasite's hold remained a gnawing presence, fueling the tension between him and every feline in the room. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion threatening to drag him under. They'd survived another confrontation, but at what cost? Nix ordered the survivors to the medbay for treatment. She beckoned for Dax to follow her down another corridor. "You need that wound checked," she said. her tone still laced with agitation. He couldn't refuse. They entered a cramped medical chamber, dimly lit with a single bed and various alien instruments along the walls. She barked orders in their language to a medic who hurried over. Dax sat on the edge of the bed, letting the medic scan him with a device that emitted a subdued hum. The reading flickered across a screen. Faint lines indicated an elevated toxin level, presumably the parasite's spread. "We'll see if we can slow it," Nick said, standing off to the side. She sounded unsteady, which was unusual for her, commanding demeanor. "We have some standard anti-venoms, but nothing specific to that thing." The medic administered a small injection that burned under Dax's skin. He hissed softly at the sting. The medic's eyes lingered on him, curiosity mingling with that same undercurrent of attraction. He looked away, not wanting to feed into it. The entire environment felt claustrophobic. Finally, the medic stepped back, issuing a curt nod. "Rest," Nix commanded, voice hollow. He nodded, sliding off the bed. "Where?" She eyed him, as though sizing up whether he deserved a real bunk or just a cell. Eventually, she gestured for him to follow her out into the corridor again. They passed a handful of remaining warriors, each battered, each giving Dax and Nix a wide berth. The parasite's tension was a constant background hum, like an inaudible frequency saturating the air. They reached a small cabin at the end of a corridor. "Stay here," she said. "Don't wander. My patience is thin and my control is thinner." He stepped inside, scanning the Spartan interior. A bed, a small table, barely enough room to pace. She lingered in the doorway, eyes dark, tail twitching. He fought the urge to challenge her, to say something that might set her off. Instead, he managed a weary nod. She turned to leave, but paused, resting a hand on the metal frame of the doorway. Without looking at him, she spoke softly. "I know you hate this as much as I do, but if we don't keep you contained, more blood will spill. My clan, your species, we could all burn in the fires of this chaos." He swallowed, fatigue overwhelming him. "Then let's stop it." She gave the barest nod, then slipped. Out, the door hissing shut behind her. He stared at the closed door for a long moment, exhaling shakily. The tension in his muscles refused to release, even though he was no longer in immediate danger. He was stuck on an alien ship with a parasite in his blood that made every feline warrior within range crave him in ways that defied logic. And the one holding the key to his survival was the fiercest of them all, a huntress named Nix who might be the only hope he had left. He dropped onto the narrow bed, wincing at the stiffness in his limbs. His eyes slid shut, but sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts spun with the memory of each near-death moment, each heated exchange. He replayed the instant in the lab when they nearly collided, the press of her body against his. The swirl of pheromones, adrenaline, and raw attraction left him restless. He hated that a part of him couldn't stop thinking about it. At some point, exhaustion claimed him, plunging him into a shallow, fitful slumber. His dreams were a jumbled mess of half-formed images, the station falling apart, the parasite's shrieks, Nix's predatory gaze in the darkness. He jerked awake, more than once heart hammering, the phantom warmth of her breath still lingering on his skin. When he couldn't drift back off, he sat up, pressing a palm to the throbbing wound on his arm. The area was hot, feverish, a constant reminder of his predicament. Time lost meaning in that cramped cabin. He wasn't sure how many hours passed before the door hissed open again. A slight figure entered, one of the younger huntresses, eyes downcast, carrying a tray of food and water. She set it on the table without meeting his gaze, then hurried out, tail swishing. He sighed, glancing at the plate of alien rations. At least they weren't starving him. He forced himself to eat, grimacing at the taste. The water, though, was a welcome relief for his parched throat. After that, he paced the small confines, testing the door. Locked from the outside, of course. He wasn't surprised. Eventually, he settled again, thoughts drifting to the data on the parasite. Was there really no cure? If not, how long before he lost control, or the entire clan lost control around him? A chime at the door startled him. It slid open, revealing Nix once more. She entered with an air of strained confidence, tail flicking restlessly. He noticed faint dark circles under her eyes, as though she'd been fighting sleep too. She didn't speak at first, just stared at him, letting the tension gather. He stood, crossing his arms, refusing to look away. "Any news?" he asked, voice rough with fatigue. She inclined her head. "We've set a course for neutral territory, an unclaimed sector where we can lie low. The others are on edge. They want answers, a plan. But this parasite's effect is making everyone unpredictable." He nodded, a cold coil of dread slithering through his stomach. "And you still in control?" She snorted softly. "Barely. Don't test me." He believed her. A few moments of silence passed, charged as ever. Then she let out a slow breath. "I'm taking you to the training room. You look restless. Some of my warriors suggested letting you work off that energy." He arched an eyebrow. "You want me to spar with your people?" Her lips quirked, in a humorless grin. "Something like that, unless you prefer to stay locked in here." He rolled his shoulders. "All right." They made their way through the corridors, attracting cautious stares from the few huntresses they passed. At one point, a tall warrior with a fresh bandage across her thigh stopped them, glaring daggers at Dax. Nyx exchanged tense words with her in their language, likely warning her to stand down. The warrior bared her fangs in frustration, but stepped aside. Soon they arrived at a small training chamber. It was ringed with padded walls and stocked with various alien melee weapons and practice dummies. The air smelled of sweat and old battles. Nyx closed the door behind them. A single overhead light cast a stark circle in the center of the room. Dax noted the presence of a few watchers in the corners, warriors who eyed him warily. One of them was the medic from earlier, arms folded, leaning against the wall. Nyx stepped into the center of the mat, rolling her neck as if loosening up. "We'll see what you can do without a gun." She tossed him a wooden practice staff. "Show me how a human fights." He caught the staff, weighing it in his grip. The last thing he wanted was to put on a performance, but if it built trust or at least let him burn some energy, it might be worthwhile. He took his position across from Nyx, meeting her gaze. She gave a subtle nod, then lunged. Their bodies collided in a flurry of movement. She struck high. He blocked, the wooden staffs clacking. Sparks of adrenaline mingled with the ever-present parasite tension, making every exchange feel supercharged. She was fast, faster than any human he'd faced, and strong enough to jar his arms with each blow. Yet he moved with practiced efficiency, spinning the staff, using footwork to keep her from pinning him. A small smirk teased at his lips when he parried a particularly aggressive strike, pivoting to sweep at her legs. She leaped, twisting mid-air with feline grace, landing behind him. He spun, raising his staff in time to catch her downward strike. The impact reverberated through his arms. Sweat beaded on his brow. She bared her fangs in a fierce grin, relishing the challenge. He realized she was testing him, perhaps testing her own reaction to him as well. He forced himself to focus on each movement, ignoring the heat roiling between them. They exchanged blow after blow, staffs whistling through the air. The watchers in the corners tensed, some gripping their own weapons, as if uncertain whether they wanted to intervene or join. Nyx made a feint, hooking one leg behind his knee. He stumbled, dropping to one knee. Her staff came down toward his head, and he instinctively ducked, slamming his shoulder into her torso. She staggered, losing balance. He surged up, pressing her back. For a moment he pinned her staff. Their chests were close, breath mingling. Her eyes locked with his, and for an instant they both froze. The watchers leaned forward as if expecting one to strike. But the real struggle was inside that shared gaze, neither wanting to yield the advantage. He felt the burn in his muscles, the pulse of blood pounding in his ears. She inhaled sharply, her pupils dilating, a primal reaction too strong to hide. He swore he could feel her heartbeat thrumming, matching his own. She abruptly shoved him off, letting out a hiss of annoyance. He stumbled back, staff still in hand. She caught her breath, whipping her tail angrily. The watchers exchanged knowing glances. Without a word, she tossed her staff aside and stormed out of the training chamber, leaving him standing there, chest heaving, uncertain how to read that sudden exit. He dropped his staff and followed, ignoring the stares of the other warriors. In the corridor, she was halfway down the hall, footsteps echoing. He jogged to catch up. "Nix," he called. She stopped, back rigid, fists clenched at her sides. When she turned, her expression was a war zone of conflicting emotions. "This can't continue," she said through gritted teeth. "Every time I get close, my body reacts. It's going to compromise my leadership." He exhaled, stepping closer. "You think I'm happy about it? I don't want to be a walking biological weapon." "But," she cut him off, voice tight. "Then help me end it." Her words hung in the stale air. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping back. "How?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, looking trapped. After a heartbeat of silence, she spoke again, more quietly. "I don't know." They stood there, the corridor lights flickering, the hum of the ship beneath their feet. The tension was excruciating. He wanted to reach out, but he didn't. Trust himself. He could see the same doubt in her eyes. If they allowed this attraction to escalate, it might tear them apart, or unify them in ways neither expected. Right now, they were both too raw to know which outcome was more likely. Footsteps approached. One of Nix's subordinates hurried up, giving them both a wary glance. The warrior spoke rapidly in their language, and Nix's expression darkened. She nodded, dismissing the huntress, then turned to Dax. "We've found a lead," she said, voice still a bit shaky. "A remote outpost that might have the technology to craft a gene blocker. We're heading there." He nodded, relief mingled with caution. "Lead the way." She spun on her heel, striding away with that same predatory grace. He followed, muscles still tingling from their spar. Each step reminded him that the line between violence and desire was razor thin. That was how it would be with them from now on, seduction as combat, each testing and resisting. Yet beneath the tension, a thread of longing wove itself deeper, into every interaction. He wasn't sure if they'd survive the battles to come, or if the parasite would claim them all. But he knew one thing. If he was going to be hunted, he'd rather it be by Nix than anyone else. And some part of him suspected she felt the same, however vehemently she tried to deny it. The outpost hung like a forgotten jewel in the void, an abandoned station that once served as a trading hub between species, now overshadowed by larger, more modern facilities. Nix's ship approached it cautiously, scanning for signs of life. The readouts indicated minimal power, no active defenses. They docked in one of the old bays, the clank of magnetized clamps echoing through the hull. In the cramped corridor, outside the airlock, Nix gathered a small contingent. Dax stood beside her, forcibly ignoring the closeness that left his nerves buzzing. She addressed the group in a clipped tone. "We get in, find the medical and research sections, and see if they have a gene blocker or the components to craft one. Stay sharp. Old stations like this can have automated defenses or worse." The door hissed open, letting them step into stale, recycled air. The lighting was dim, half of the overhead panels flickering. The outpost's corridors felt eerily empty, their footsteps echoing. Dax kept his sidearm ready, scanning corners for movement. Occasionally, a distant hum or a sputtering spark broke the silence, reminding them the station wasn't completely dead. They reached a main atrium with branching paths. Old signs in multiple languages hinted at various facilities: docking bays, commerce halls, recreational wings. Nix's gaze lingered on a sign pointing to a biotech lab. She nodded that way, and the group proceeded. As they walked, Dax noticed battered storefronts and rusted shutters, remnants of a once bustling place. The tension was thick, everyone was on edge, especially around him. He could sense the occasional wary stares. Despite that, the unspoken alliance with Nix gave him a measure of safety from her subordinates. They arrived at a section labeled Research and Development. The automatic doors sputtered but eventually slid open. Inside, rows of long-abandoned labs were littered with broken equipment. Dust motes danced in the faint light. A stale chemical smell lingered in the air. The group fanned out, searching for anything useful. Dax and Nix checked a corner lab, stepping over broken glass. He tried a terminal, but it was dead. "Power's too low," he muttered. "We'll need to restore some systems." Nix spotted a door labeled Generator Access. She kicked it, and it gave way, revealing a cramped maintenance passage leading down a flight of metal steps. "We'll see if we can jumpstart the auxiliary power," she said, glancing at him. "Stay close." He followed her down, the steps creaking ominously. Their flashlights carved narrow beams through the dusty dark. Eventually, they emerged into a small generator room, dominated by a cylindrical fusion core. It was offline, dust covering its control panels. Nyx muttered under her breath, wiping it away to reveal a cracked screen. Dax stepped in, fiddling with the archaic controls. "It might still hold a charge," he said after a moment, gesturing to a cluster of old fuel cells stacked in the corner. "If we can reroute the power lines, we could get enough juice for the labs." Nyx nodded, surprisingly patient, despite the tension radiating off her. They worked in silence, him prying open panels, her handing him tools. Each time their fingers brushed, a flicker of tension burned hotter. Finally, he managed to coax the fusion core into a low-power startup. Lights flickered around them, and the hum of machinery stirred to life. They returned to the lab level, rejoining the others. Panels blinked with partial functionality. A few monitors glowed, though most were riddled with static. The group spread out, searching for anything resembling a gene blocker or advanced medical kit. Dax followed Nyx to a door marked Pharmaceutical Storage. It hissed open reluctantly, revealing a room lined with shelves. Many compartments lay empty or looted, but some locked cabinets remained sealed. He tried the controls, and a small console asked for an access code. He tapped a few override attempts, but the system blinked a denial. He glanced at Nyx. "We could blast it open, but that might destroy whatever's inside." She moved beside him, scanning the panel with her own device. "Hold on, we have a hacking module." She withdrew a small cylinder from her belt, placing it against the console. Lights on the cylinder blinked, and after a tense moment, the lock beeped, sliding open. Inside were vials, sealed containers, and data chips, all carefully labeled. Some were cracked or corroded, but a handful looked intact. Nyx sifted through them, tail flicking in excitement. Gene therapy vials, immunoboosters. She paused at a canister labeled in multiple languages, some of which Dax recognized as references to advanced blockers. This might be it. A surge of hope flared in him. "Check if it's stable." She tapped a built-in scanner. The readout came back uncertain, indicating partial viability. "We'll need to test it." She carefully cradled it. "But we might have our solution." He exhaled, relief washing through him. Finally, a tangible lead. If they could refine or replicate the formula, they might block the parasite's pheromone effect. He wasn't naive enough to think it would cure him outright, but at least it could dampen the chaos swirling around him. They regrouped with the others, who had found more bits of research data. Nyx clutched the canister protectively, instructing them to return to the ship. But just as they turned to go, a low rumble shuddered through the outpost, and an automated voice crackled through ancient speakers in an alien dialect, presumably an emergency announcement. Lights flashed red. The BE. Group tensed. "What now?" Dax asked, scanning the corridor. Nyx growled. "Could be a security protocol, or the station's failing systems. Either way, we need to move." They rushed back toward the docking bay, but as they neared the atrium, the floor quaked, buckling under some internal stress. A chunk of ceiling collapsed, blocking their path, with twisted metal and sparking cables. A second passage led off to the side. Nyx cursed, leading them that way. The tension ramped up further when they heard a distant whirring, a mechanical drone or turret spinning to life. The outpost's automated security was reactivating. A spidery turret slid down from the ceiling at the far end of the corridor, scanning with a bright red laser. One of Nyx's warriors fired, but the turret retaliated instantly, sending a barrage of plasma bolts that forced them to dive for cover. Smoke filled the hallway. Dax coughed, pressing against a wall. He looked at Nyx. She was pinned down behind a collapsed kiosk, the canister clutched to her chest. "I'll draw its fire!" Dax shouted. Without waiting for permission, he darted across the corridor, firing his sidearm to grab the turret's attention. It swiveled, unleashing a hail of bolts that sizzled past him, scorching the ground. He slid behind a column, heart hammering. Nick seized the moment to sprint forward, returning fire with lethal accuracy. One of the bolts connected with the turret sensor array, sending sparks cascading. The machine jerked wildly, then powered, down in a burst of smoke. He rejoined her, panting, the rest of the group converging. They hurried on, navigating a labyrinth of failing corridors. More tremors rattled the station's structure, threatening another collapse. At last, they found a route leading to their docking bay. As they emerged, they saw their ship waiting, ramp extended. The final stretch was a frantic dash. Steel beams screeched overhead, the deck plating cracking beneath them. A vent burst, spewing steam so hot it seared the walls. Nix's team scrambled, aboard shouting for immediate takeoff. Dax, near the back, felt a surge of adrenaline that propelled him across the threshold just as another explosion rocked the bay. The ramp closed behind them, sealing away the chaos outside. Lights flashed inside the vessel as the engines roared to life. The pilot wasted no time, detaching from the outpost and boosting them into open space. Dax braced himself in the corridor, swallowing a lump of relief. They'd made it. He turned to see Nix slumped against a wall, cradling the canister of potential. Gene blocker. Her breathing was ragged, eyes half-lidded as if the emotional strain was catching up to her. "You all right?" he asked softly, stepping closer. She nodded, but didn't move for a moment. A few of her warriors rushed past, heading to the command deck to assist. The corridor quieted, leaving them a moment of privacy. He reached out a hand, but she waved him away, forcing herself upright. Her tail lashed once, a frustrated gesture. Then, to his surprise, she leaned against him slightly, letting the tension ease from her shoulders. "Just give me a moment," she muttered, voice low. "I need to catch my breath." He stood still, letting her rest against his side. The closeness stirred that now familiar sizzle of attraction, but he didn't pull away. Her muscles trembled under her armor, adrenaline fading. She exhaled, a faint purr rolling through her chest, as if unintentional. He tried to ignore the warmth spreading along his spine, focusing instead on the canister in her grasp. "That stuff's our best hope," he asked quietly, nodding to it. She inclined her head. "We need to test it. Maybe refine it." She stepped back, forcibly, putting distance between them again. The momentary vulnerability vanished behind her usual guarded expression. "Come, we'll have the medic analyze it in the lab." They made their way to the small onboard lab where earlier they'd studied the Parasite data. The medic and a handful of others joined them. Nick set the canister on a sterile platform, hooking it up to a scanner. As readouts appeared, the group watched anxiously. Some lines indicated partial degradation, but enough of the original compound was intact to theoretically create a functional dose. The medic hissed in contemplation. "We'll need to reconstitute it with fresh genetic material. That means we'll need samples from the infected host." Dax tensed. "Me." Nix's tail flicked. "Will that be enough?" The medic shrugged, eyes darting between the readouts. "It might be, if we combine the gene blocker base with a sample of the parasite's mutated code from him. We can tailor the serum to neutralize its pheromonal effect." Dax hesitated, glancing at Nix. This was what they'd been hoping for, but the idea of letting them tinker with his DNA was unnerving. Then again, living with the parasite was no better. He gave a nod, rolling up his sleeve to expose the scarred bite. "Do it." The medic prepared a collection device, drawing a vial of blood from his arm. He gritted his teeth at the sting. Nix watched in silence, her gaze intense. The medic then began the delicate process of synthesizing a custom serum, injecting the newly combined sample into a small chamber for accelerated processing. They'd used the station's data to rig a makeshift gene splicer. It whirred and blinked, performing its arcane function. Minutes stretched into an hour, tension simmering. Dax, exhausted, sat on a bench near the lab's edge. Nix paced, tail lashing intermittently. Occasionally their eyes met, but they said nothing. The others hovered, exchanging hushed remarks in their language. Finally, the machine let out a sharp beep. The medic rushed to check the readouts, then turned with a cautious nod. "It's ready for trial," she announced, holding up a small vial of luminescent fluid. Nix approached, hand outstretched, but the medic hesitated. "We should test a small dose on him first," the medic said, glancing at Dax. "If it doesn't kill him, we can see if it blocks the pheromones." He rose, swallowing hard. "Let's get it over with." The medic loaded a hyposyringe, pressing it against his neck. A cold hiss. He felt the fluid enter his bloodstream, cool and tingling. Nix watched, arms crossed, every muscle taut. For several moments, he felt nothing except a mild numbness at the injection site. Then a slow burn spread through his veins, eliciting a gasp. He gripped the edge of a table to steady himself. His vision blurred. The burn intensified, then gradually receded, leaving him shivering. A fine sheen of sweat coated his skin. The medic ran a scanner over him, frowning at the numbers. "No sign of immediate rejection," she murmured. "We'll see if it—" She didn't finish. One of the other huntresses in the room took a step closer to Dax, inhaling deeply as if testing the air. She blinked, confusion flitting across her features. Then she shrugged, turning to the medic with a short comment in their language. Dax couldn't pass it, but from the medic's slight nod, he guessed the warrior had said she felt no attraction. Nix stiffened, as if bracing for disappointment or relief. She took a slow step toward Dax, eyes locked on his. He felt his pulse quicken. Would it work on her? She was far more attuned to him than the others. She circled him, inhaling carefully. He fought the urge to flush under her scrutiny. Her expression remained unreadable. Then she exhaled and gave a small shake of her head as if marveling. "It's duller," she admitted quietly, eyes flicking over him. "The pull, I mean." Dax's heart thudded. "So it's working?" Nix nodded slowly. "At least." "Partially? I don't feel that overwhelming urge." She paused, meeting his gaze. "That doesn't mean I'm not still interested. But it's my own interest now, not the parasite." He released a pent-up breath, relief washing over him. The others in the room seemed equally stunned or cautiously hopeful. The medic ran more scans. "We'll keep monitoring, but this is promising. We can replicate more doses, ensure the entire clan is immune if need be." The next few hours were a blur of follow-up tests and data analysis. Dax's head swam from the injection, but the sense of freedom was intoxicating. He could stand among them without feeling that constant, suffocating tension. They no longer stared at him with predatory hunger. Nix, too, seemed more at ease, though still guarded, her tail swishing whenever they locked eyes. Finally, the medic cleared him to leave the lab. Nix escorted him out into a quieter corridor, the hum of the ship comforting beneath their feet. She glanced at him sideways. "You must be relieved." He gave a slow nod. "I am. But it's not a complete fix, right? We still need to see if the parasite itself is contained." She agreed. "Yes, but now you won't drive my kind mad just by breathing." She smirked, a small ironic twist of her lips. "That's progress." A thoughtful silence settled between them. He realized this might be the first moment they'd been alone without the parasite's thrall looming over them. The difference was subtle yet profound. She still had an undeniable magnetism, her sleek form, intense eyes, the aura of command, but now it was her own, not forced by biology. He cleared his throat. "So, what happens next?" She stared at a point on the bulkhead, then turned to face him fully. "We need to make a decision. Whether to continue searching for a full cure that removes the parasite from your system, or to accept this partial fix and focus on the political aftermath. Because once my clan learns about the serum, they'll want it. Rival clans, too." He frowned. "A war for control of the cure?" She gave a grim nod. "Precisely. Some might want to replicate the parasite effect for their own advantage, others will want it destroyed. This serum could be the only safeguard." He felt a weight settle on him. "If that's the case, we might have to protect it. Protect each other." Her tail swished and she regarded him with a searching gaze. "That means you'd stay with us, at least for the time being." A beat of silence passed. He wasn't sure if the swirling feeling in his chest was excitement or dread. He'd come to see her clan as dangerous captors, but now they might be allies. And Nix herself. He could no longer deny the bond forming between them. Even if the pheromone thrall was dampened, the memory of that tension, the shared battles, lingered. He took a tentative step closer. "I guess I owe you my life, more than once." She huffed a soft laugh. "You do." They stood close, but not too close, each respecting the other's space. The overhead lights flickered, reminding them they were still on a warship, still in the midst of uncertainty. But this quiet moment felt fragile, like a ceasefire. He remembered how she'd pinned him in the corridor, how her breath had ghosted across his neck. Part of him wondered if that was only because of the parasite, or if there was something more beneath the forced attraction. He noticed how her eyes flicked to his lips briefly before darting away. There was a subtle tension still, a desire that neither could fully quell, but it no longer felt like an uncontrollable compulsion. It was sharper, real. She seemed to notice him noticing, and her ears flicked back in embarrassment or annoyance. "You should rest," she said abruptly. "Let the serum fully integrate." He nodded, understanding her retreat. "Yeah." She turned, heading down the corridor. Before she disappeared around a corner, she paused, glancing back. "Dax." He looked at her questioningly. Her gaze flickered away, then returned, a small, almost reluctant smile tugging at her lips. "You fought well today." A warmth spread through his chest. He offered a small nod of thanks, and she vanished from sight. He made his way back to the cabin he'd been assigned, mind buzzing with thoughts. For the first time since he was captured, he felt something akin to hope. The parasite was still in him, but muted. The clan no longer regarded him as a ticking time bomb. And Nyx, she wasn't just his captor anymore. He sank onto the bunk, letting the exhaustion wash over him. Tomorrow they'd face new threats, rival clans, the question of distributing the serum, the possibility of forging alliances or waging wars. But tonight at least, the relentless haze of primal attraction had lessened. He could breathe, think, and maybe even dream without the constant threat of losing himself. He drifted off eventually, slipping into a deeper sleep than he'd had in days. This time, the nightmares of parasites and monstrous transformations were tempered by fleeting images of Nyx's dark eyes, her fierce smirk. In that half-aware place between waking and dreaming, he sensed that their fates were now entwined, no longer bound by forced pheromones, but by a mutual desire to survive, and perhaps something more. He woke to the sound of alarms blaring through the corridors. Tension spiked instantly, adrenaline surging as he jumped to his feet. The lights glowed red, indicating a high-level alert. He bolted out the door into the hallway, nearly colliding with two huntresses rushing past. "What's going on?" he demanded, voice hoarse with sleep. One snapped in their language, motioning for him to follow. They raced toward the bridge, passing others who scrambled to stations. The entire ship shook as if under external force. Dax felt his stomach lurch. Were they under attack? He burst onto the bridge to see Nyx standing at the central console, barking orders. A view of space stretched across the main screen, revealing two hostile vessels approaching at speed. Their insignia marked them as another clan, possibly allied with the one that had tried to ambush them on the derelict cruiser. Nyx glanced at Dax, expression grim. "We have company. They're demanding we surrender or be boarded." He rushed to her side, scanning the readouts. "They must have tracked us somehow." She nodded, tail lashing. "They know about you and likely the serum." A voice crackled over the comm, harsh and authoritative, speaking in the feline language. Dax caught a few words, enough to piece together that they wanted the human turned over and the serum confiscated. Nyx responded in a snarl, refusing. Tensions soared. Without warning, energy blasts streaked across the void, rattling Nyx's ship. A console sparked, and one huntress scrambled to reroute power. Nyx hissed, "Shields up! Prepare for evasive maneuvers." Dax looked around, uncertain how to help in a starship battle. He found a secondary console and tapped into sensor data. The attacking vessels were fast and well-armed. Nyx's ship was outnumbered and outgunned. Fear churned in his gut, but he forced calm. If they wanted him so badly, maybe there was a way to use that. Still, it was a terrifying proposition. The blasts continued, rocking the ship. Alarms wailed. Nix roared orders. The pilot banked hard, weaving them between incoming fire. For a moment it looked like they might slip away, but the second enemy vessel closed in from the opposite side, launching a barrage that slammed into the hull. Power flickered dangerously. "Engines critical!" a huntress shouted. Nix cursed, thumping a fist on the console. She turned to Dax, frustration and desperation etched on her face. "If they disable us, they'll board. We're low on options." He gritted his teeth. "We can't outrun them, so maybe we can outsmart them." His mind raced. What if we pretend to surrender, draw them in close, then sabotage their boarding operation? Her eyes narrowed, considering. Risky. They might just blow us apart once we lower shields. He shook his head. "They want me alive." She looked torn. The ship shook again, lights flickering as another blast tore across the shield. Then she let out a sharp breath. "Do it. Stand by the airlock. We'll hail them, say we'll hand you over. When they come aboard, we strike." He swallowed hard, but nodded. This was insane, but better than being slaughtered in a hopeless firefight. She signaled the pilot to throttle down. The ship's engines powered down to minimal thrust, and the shield flickered as they diverted energy. Then, Nix opened a channel to the approaching vessels, speaking quickly in a feigned voice of capitulation. She promised to turn over the human if they ceased fire. A tense moment followed. The enemy ships halted their barrage, drifting closer. Dax headed to the airlock, accompanied by a small group of Nix's best warriors. She joined them, carrying a rifle. Her eyes locked with his, and he saw raw tension behind her stoic mask. "If this fails," she said, voice low, "we all die." He nodded grimly. "We won't fail." She signaled to open the outer hatch. Almost immediately, an enemy boarding tube extended, clamping onto their hull. A hiss of pressure equalization followed. The door slid open, revealing a line of heavily armed feline warriors with weapons raised. Their leader, a scarred male with an insignia on his chest, stepped forward. His gaze raked over Nix's group, settling on Dax with obvious hunger. "Stand aside," he growled, voice dripping with triumph. "The human comes with us." Nix lifted her chin, tail swishing in an act of reluctant compliance. "Take him." She reached out as if to shove Dax forward. Dax feigned defeat, stepping away from Nix. His heart pounded. The enemy warriors advanced, momentarily lowering their guard. But just as they moved to seize him, Nix's voice rang out in a battle cry. At her signal, her warriors opened fire in a hail of plasma bolts. Dax dove to the side, rolling behind a crate. The corridor filled with the shriek of weapons discharge. The enemy reeled, some falling instantly. Others retaliated, unleashing blasts that scored the walls and floor. Chaos erupted. Dax scrambled for a dropped rifle, returning fire. One of. The enemy warriors lunged at him with claws bared. He dodged, slammed the butt of the rifle into the attacker's gut, then fired point blank. Blood sprayed the corridor. The boarding tube behind them sparked as blast shredded its metal plating. Nix fought like a demon, weaving through blasts with lethal precision. A shot grazed her arm, but she didn't slow, driving a dagger into the chest of an enemy that lunged at her. Smoke filled the airlock as their combined assault forced the enemy back. The scarred leader roared in fury, calling for reinforcements. More warriors spilled through the tube, but Nix's team held the line. Dax felt a surge of grim satisfaction. They had the advantage of the choke point. The boarding parties couldn't swarm through easily. He fired until his rifle overheated, then switched to a sidearm. Bodies piled up, and the corridor reeked of scorched metal and burning fur. The scarred leader realized the boarding was failing and bellowed a retreat. The ones left alive scrambled back toward their ship. "Close it," Nix snarled, gesturing to the airlock console. One of her warriors slammed the emergency release, detaching the tube. A metallic groan echoed as the clamp separated. The enemy vessel lurched away, drifting in space. Dax half expected them to resume firing, but with so many of their warriors dead or injured, they might think twice. For a tense beat they waited. Sensors beeped, indicating the enemy ships were pulling back. Finally they warped out of range, leaving Nix's vessel battered but not destroyed. A collective exhale filled the airlock. Adrenaline still coursed through Dax, making his hands shake. He glanced around, seeing that they'd lost two of Nyx's warriors in the firefight. Their bodies lay still, eyes open in vacant stares. Nyx swore under her breath, kneeling beside one fallen comrade. A heavy sadness descended. Dax lowered his head, feeling guilt knot his stomach. This was his fault in a way. They were here because of the parasite's hold on him. He forced himself to lock eyes with Nyx. She looked up, sorrow etched in her features, blood dripping from the slash on her arm. But beneath the grief, there was a fierce resolve. She stood, wiping her blade on a rag. "Are you hurt?" she asked, voice tight. He shook his head, panting. "Just scratches." She inclined her head, acknowledging. Then she surveyed the corridor, smoke curling around them, and finally let out a ragged breath. "We survived. Again." He wanted to say something comforting, but words felt hollow. Instead, he rested a hand on her uninjured shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. She tensed but didn't pull away, her eyes drifting to his. "We can't keep fighting like this," she murmured. "We'll be hunted wherever we go." He nodded. "We need allies or a place to hide." She sighed, tail curling around her ankle. "Allies are hard to come by, but maybe we can forge a truce with a neutral clan, someone who wants the serum without using it as a weapon." He didn't know enough about her people's politics to offer suggestions, but he recognized that forging alliances would be the only way to prevent open war. They couldn't do it alone. As her surviving warriors carried away the fallen, she and Dax moved to the bridge to survey the damage. Systems were strained, but the ship remained functional. The pilot confirmed they could still jump to FTL if needed. Exhaustion weighed on everyone. Nyx collapsed into the command chair, head in her hands. Dax hovered by a console, uncertain. Finally, she spoke in a voice hoarse with fatigue. "Plot a course to a remote star system. We'll lie low and see if we can contact a clan that might be open to negotiation." The pilot nodded, setting coordinates. The ship rumbled, engines powering up. Dax lingered near Nyx. He wanted to say something to ease her burden, but the tension in the air was suffocating. She sensed his presence and glanced up, eyes weary. "You think we're cursed?" He forced a small, humorless smile. "Feels like it, but we keep surviving." She shook her head. "Maybe that's the problem." He had no reply. She closed her eyes, leaning back in the chair as the ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, streaking through the void. Outside the viewport, stars blurred into lines of luminescent color. Inside, they were left with the aftermath of another battle, bruised hearts, and too many unanswered questions. The remote star system they fled to was little more than a dark corner of the galaxy, its primary star a dim red dwarf. Scattered asteroids and debris fields indicated the remnants of some ancient cosmic event. Nyx's ship drifted there in silence, running minimal power to avoid detection. Repairs were underway, though the crew's morale was low. Dax found himself in the medbay again, getting a checkup from the medic to ensure the serum was still effective. It was. The parasite's pheromone effect had receded to near insignificance, which was a huge relief. Yet the underlying infection remained, dormant but not gone. The medic recommended routine injections to keep it suppressed. After the exam, he wandered to the cargo hold, finding a quiet spot among the crates. Sleep was elusive. His mind churned, with images of the battles, the station, the constant threat from other clans. Most of all, he couldn't stop thinking about Nyx. The glimpses of vulnerability she'd shown, the tension between them that no longer felt purely chemical. He startled at the sound of footsteps. Turning, he saw Nyx approaching, her silhouette illuminated by the faint overhead glow. She wore a simpler outfit now, armor stripped away for comfort, revealing toned arms and the curve of her collarbone. A bandage was wrapped around her upper arm where she'd been grazed. She looked at him, expression unreadable, then leaned against a crate opposite him. "I figured I'd find you here," she said softly. He managed a wry smile. "Couldn't sleep," she nodded. "Neither can I." An unspoken weight hung between them. They both knew that in the short time they'd been thrust together, they'd faced more death and destruction than most see in a lifetime. She folded her arms, tail coiling slowly at her feet. "You're not just some prisoner anymore. You've fought beside us, saved my life, and cost us lives. My people, they don't know what to think of you, neither do I." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I never wanted any of this. But if I can help, I will. I don't want more blood spilled on my account." She studied him, eyes narrowing. "Would you stay with us, even if it meant fighting more of my people's battles?" He hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't have a lot of options. My own people won't welcome me back with open arms, not with this parasite inside. Me, and even if they did, I'd be a walking threat. Maybe it's better to stay here where we can manage it together." She lowered her gaze, exhaling. "I thought so." They fell into a silence that pulsed with unspoken tension. Unlike before, it wasn't purely born of pheromones. This was the weight of two warriors who'd fought on opposite sides, then reluctantly joined forces, forging something fragile and real in the heat of battle. He could sense how close they were to crossing an invisible line. He stood, stepping nearer. "Nix." She looked up. Their eyes locked. The cargo hold felt smaller, the air charged. This time there was no forced attraction, no primal chemical push, just them. She moved closer, each step measured as if expecting him to retreat, but he didn't. When she reached him, they stood barely a breath apart, tension coiled like a spring. His heart thundered. She lifted a hand, letting her fingers graze the edge of his jaw. He inhaled sharply, the warmth of her touch igniting a trail of sparks across his skin. She tilted her head, watching his reaction, a question in her eyes. He answered by leaning in, pressing his forehead lightly to hers. Their breath mingled, and for a moment no words were needed. A shiver ran through him, and he felt her pulse quicken against his chest. "Why now?" she murmured. "You know how dangerous this is for both of us." He gave a ghost of a smile. "Because we might not have tomorrow." She let out a soft laugh, part amusement, part resignation. Then her lips crashed against his in a fierce, desperate kiss. Nothing gentle about it. Their hands clawed at each other, a clash of wills even in intimacy. He backed her against a crate, deepening the kiss, hearts pounding in unison. Every brush of their tongues felt like a challenge, a test of resolve. She growled low in her throat, gripping his shoulders, nails biting into his skin. He didn't yield. She nipped at his lower lip, and he responded by pulling her closer, losing himself in the swirl of sensation that had been building for what felt like forever. There was a heat to it, not just from the parasite's leftover threads, but from genuine want forged in combat and shared survival. Each of them tried to dominate, to take the upper hand until they both realized it wasn't about winning. It was about surrendering together. At length, they broke apart, panting, foreheads pressed together. He tasted blood on his lip. Her little nip had drawn it. She smelled of adrenaline and something uniquely hers. She stared at him, chest heaving, eyes flickering with a mix of triumph and awe. "I hate you," she breathed, but there was no venom in it. "For making me feel this," he swallowed, voice thick. "Then hate me, but don't stop." She chuckled, low and throaty, before pulling him into another heated kiss. The cargo hold's darkness enveloped them, and for the first time in days, they lost themselves in something other than fear or anger. It was raw, an outlet for their pent-up emotions, a violent, hungry love story written in bruises and stolen breaths. Time blurred. When they finally pulled away, leaning on each other for balance, the tension felt different, cathartic, a release. She rested her forehead on his shoulder, exhaling a shaky breath. "This doesn't change the fact that we're at war with half the galaxy." He let out a breathless laugh. "I know." She lifted her gaze. "We'll have to be stronger than ever. The clans that come after us won't show mercy." He nodded. "Then we'll fight back. We'll use the serum, forge alliances, whatever it takes." She stepped back, smoothing her hair, regaining composure. The fierce warrior in her reasserted itself, though her eyes shone with a new light. "You'd stand with me?" He offered a small, weary smile. "I already have." That seemed to satisfy her. She took his hand, leading him out of the cargo hold. They returned to the corridors, to the hum of the ship, the faint red glow of the emergency lights still in place. On the bridge, the pilot and crew pretended not to notice their disheveled appearances or the lingering flush in their cheeks. The political situation hadn't changed, but something between them had. Days passed in a blur of negotiations, covert communications, and tense vigilance. Nix reached out to a clan rumored to have neutral standing in the conflict, offering a meeting in a hidden asteroid field. Dax helped oversee the distribution of the serum among her warriors, ensuring they'd be immune to any parasite tricks. Gradually, the clan's distrust of him lessened, though many still eyed him with caution. Each evening, Nix and Dax would find a private moment, a stolen conversation, a shared meal, or a quiet embrace in the ship's shadows. Their bond grew, forged in mutual respect and sharpened desire. He discovered new scars on her body, each with a story of survival. She learned about his life before the parasite, the battles he'd fought in human space. They never openly called it love, but there was no denying the inevitability of their connection. Finally, the day came for the secret summit in the asteroid field. Nix's ship arrived first, coasting among drifting rocks that cast eerie shadows. Tension crackled on the bridge as they waited. Dax stood beside Nix, hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. If the neutral clan betrayed them, it could all end in blood. A sleek vessel emerged, scanning them briefly before docking in a shared docking bubble. Nix assembled a small delegation, herself, Dax, and a few trusted warriors. They boarded the bubble, meeting the representatives of the neutral clan in a confined space, with transparent walls offering a view of drifting asteroids. The neutral leader, a tall female with a regal bearing, regarded Dax with open curiosity. Nix presented the serum, explaining its purpose to block the parasite's pheromones. The neutral leader listened carefully, eyes gleaming at the potential. Dax felt uneasy, recalling how easily knowledge could be weaponized. But Nix pressed on, proposing an alliance. The neutral clan would support their efforts to contain the parasite's spread, and in return, they'd share the serum's formula so the neutral clan could protect themselves. "It's better than letting it spark wars," Nix said. "We want peace under our terms." The neutral leader studied them both, noticing how Nix stood protectively close to Dax. A sly smile curved the leader's lips. "Very well. We agree in principle, but we need guarantees." "What kind of guarantees?" Nix asked, tail flicking, with mild impatience. "A demonstration, perhaps. Let us see that your human truly no longer exerts the thrall." The leader beckoned one of her subordinates, who stepped forward, a lithe feline warrior with shimmering fur. The subordinate approached Dax, inhaling as they circled him. Dax forced himself to stay calm. The warrior's face remained neutral. "No effect," the warrior reported, stepping back. "He's just a man." The leader gave a satisfied nod. "It seems you've neutralized the parasite's biggest danger. That is promising." Nix exhaled a faint sigh of relief. Dax felt it too. An actual alliance might be within reach. They continued talks, refining terms, discussing trade routes and mutual defense pacts. By the end, it appeared both sides had a workable agreement. The neutral clan would keep the serum's secret safe and help Nix's people stand against any clans that sought to exploit the parasite. When the meeting concluded, Nix and Dax returned to their ship. As they peeled away, from the docking bubble the relief was palpable. Nix's warriors exchanged cautious smiles, some even patting Dax on the shoulder. Progress had been made, perhaps the start of a lasting peace. Yet both he and Nix knew that not all clans would stand down so easily. They jumped to a safer location, a star system within Nix's clan's domain. There, they were greeted by a small station loyal to her faction, battered from recent skirmishes but still standing. A welcome party of feline warriors saluted Nix, though their eyes flicked with interest at the presence of the human at her side. Word was spreading that he was no longer a threat, that together they'd found a solution. Later that night, in a private chamber on the station, Dax and Nyx found themselves alone again. Exhaustion weighed on them, but also a sense of triumph. She sank onto a bench, tail swishing idly, while he stood by the window, gazing out at the stars. They'd come so far, survived so much. A wave of gratitude washed over him. "I never thought I'd owe my life to a cat alien," he said wryly, glancing over his shoulder at her. She smirked, hooking a finger at him. "Come here." He obeyed, moving to stand before her. She rested a palm on his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat. "We have a chance now, a real chance to end the bloodshed. Or at least reduce it." He nodded, covering her hand with his own. "And what about us?" Her gaze softened. The intensity of her predatory stare mingled with something gentler. "I'm done fighting it. Whatever we have, I want it. But it won't be easy. My clan expects strength and leadership. Some won't accept a human mate." He let out a low breath, heart thudding at her choice of words. "Mate," he repeated softly, tasting the idea. It felt monumental. Then he gave her a small, determined smile. "They don't have to accept me. As long as they accept you, I can handle the rest." Her eyes glimmered with a rare spark of amusement. "Brave words, human." He bent down, pressing a slow, lingering kiss to her lips. This time there was no sense of urgency or desperation, just a quiet, powerful acknowledgement of what they'd endured. She pulled him closer, arms circling his waist, tail curling around his leg. They lost themselves in that warmth for a while, letting the station's distant hum lull them. Eventually he drew back, still cradling her face. "You know," he whispered, "I think that Parasite did us a favor. Without it, I'd never have been forced to see you this way." She chuckled softly, a low purr vibrating in her throat. "Careful. I might take offense at that." He smirked. "Then let's just say, I'm glad you didn't kill me when you had the chance." She nipped at his lower lip with gentle playfulness. "I still might if you ever give me a reason." His grin widened. "I'll make sure I don't." They shared a moment of laughter, the weight of the galaxies. Conflicts momentarily lifted. Outside the window, starlight shimmered, a testament to endless possibilities. They had found each other through violence and chaos, bound by a parasite's bite that nearly destroyed them. Now, as they stood at the threshold of a fragile peace, they carried a bond forged not by infection but by choice. Word would spread of their alliance, of the serum that could neutralize the parasite's thrall. Rival clans might still scheme, and battles might still loom on the horizon. But for this moment they had each other, and that was enough. In the quiet hush of that station, their fate felt sealed. Not by forced pheromones, but by shared conviction and a raw, undeniable love, born against all odds. He brushed a strand of her dark hair aside, studying the fierce contour of her face, the resolute set of her jaw. She was everything he never knew he wanted, dangerous, commanding, and utterly mesmerizing. She looked back at him, seeing the hardened soldier who refused to die, the man who smirked at danger. A faint smile touched her lips. "Stay with me," she murmured. He nodded, heart thudding. "Always." And so their story found its resolution in the echoes of war and the promise of something greater. No cliffhanger waited to snatch away their fragile happiness, no final betrayal to tear them apart. They had chosen each other, and that choice stood firm like a blade plunged into solid ground. Whatever the future held, clan politics, cosmic threats, or the lingering presence of an alien parasite, they would face it side by side. And if he was going to be hunted by an entire alien cat species, he'd made his choice. He would rather it be by her than anyone else.